What influence did Christianity have on the founding of the United States of America? Welcome to Revolution Against Evolution. I'm your host, Doug Sharp.
Your co-host Richard Gere here as well. And yeah, at this time of the year, Doug, it's very kind of appropriate. So
I want to go back into the colonial days when we had the various people preaching in the United States, which wasn't the United States at the time, but it was the colonies. We had people like George Whitfield, who was a preacher from Great Britain. We had Charles and John Wesley, who also came over from England and did some preaching in the country.
now you're
And
talking a little bit after the colony. That's in the late 1700s, isn't it?
late 17,
1780s. Yeah.
yeah, the 1770s, 1750 to 1780, something like that, where
Yeah.
they were having quite an influence in the thinking of the whole country, and a great revival broke out. A lot of people came to the Lord, and there were many places where, the majority of people just by their definition went to church, and they became Christian in their thinking. And so if we look back at the different documents that were drawn up at the time when the American Revolution took place, there were the Declaration of Independence has in it references to our Creator, and I'm going to read that. It,
Okay.
it says, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands that have connected them with another and assumed among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And so it goes on to say that when any form of government uh, starts to become destructive and oppressive, there is a right for the people to throw off that government and to become free. And I think that's one of the things that was going on is that people were starting to realize that they cannot stand by and be complacent anymore. They needed to take some action and correct the wrongs that were being they were being held to in this particular time of history. And so there is this appeal to the supreme judge of the world that and it talked about that at the end of the declaration that they are to be able to throw off the appeal to the Supreme Judge for the rectitude of our intentions to do in the name authority of the good people of the colonies, solemnly publish and declare that the United Colonies are and of right ought to be freed and independent states, and they are absolved from the allegiance to the British Crown in all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain. And so that was, part of there was a whole list of grievances against the king.
I heard there was like over 20, 23 of them. There were 20. We don't really talk much about those. And I got to be truthful. I don't really know what they all are. I know taxation without representation was part of one of them, I think,
Right.
but maybe I'm wrong there. But I'm not really sure what all the grievances were. But we focus on that. We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights by the Creator, and I think Doug that goes to the heart of why we defend vociferously the biblical doctrine of creation is because we feel that the only one that has the right to impose from the top down rules is the creator who's outside of humanity, who's above humanity, if you will. But no human is above another human in the sense that we are all made in his image. We are created in his image, and we all were created equal. In that regard, we say, well, then how do we know who defines what morality is, what truth is? Unless it's somebody or some being outside of humanity, then it's basically devolves into a consensus opinion. Might makes right. Whoever has the biggest bank account or the strongest military will be the ones that dominate until that paradigm changes. So there's no morality that's totally consistent with this. This is a unique document in the history of mankind. I don't know of any other thing like it. There's some now that's come, but they were inspired by the United States. But before that, it was all pretty much about kings and rulers and emperors and dictators, despots, if you will. Some of them were more just than others. But you never had an idea that all of us were created equal, and the governance powers are dependent upon those who are being governed. In other words, the people themselves are the ones that can do it. Now, there is an interesting thing about our founding fathers. They set up, and a lot of people are railing against it today, but they set up what's called an electoral college, or it's really not a true democracy. It's a democratic republic in that sense, because what you have to do is representatives that help us decide things, but they are elected by the voters. But the idea is that you don't want to have some governance descend into what's called mob rule, because despite the fact that we realize our rights are endowed by our creator, not the state, nevertheless, the state getting power ultimately will try to get more and more power, try to accrue more onto itself based on the nature of who we are as fallen people. So representatives kind of help mitigate that, not entirely, but it does a lot. Most democracies descend into mob rule. In fact, if we had true democracy, we pretty much have 5 states, really 5 cities, would dominate every election. Because that was what would happen, and that's what they did not want to happen. So I think that was a pretty ingenious, if not a final solution or a permanent solution, at least a pretty good solution for a long, long period of time. That's why we are the longest surviving democracy of all time, because of some of these other things that have come in. But ultimately, Doug, the idea that the governing bodies are dictated by those who are being governed over, and that is restricted as well. A lot of those things, because all of us have inherent rights that are self-evident given by God, not the state. This is a huge, huge difference from everything else. And our founding fathers are pretty much consistent in all of this. They really were, weren't they?
Yeah, they took most of their ideas from biblical values and
Yes.
biblical precepts, knowing that the nature of man was fallen and that we had this propensity towards doing things the wrong way. And so there was a lot of checks and balances that they put in place with the House and the Senate and the executive branch and the judicial branch, where you had them. It was sort of like a meat grinder of ideas where you're making sausages, and yet
Well,
the problem, the thing of it is, it's a way to try to reach a consensus, and the problem is that when you have a majority of people who are not concerned with morality or truth or
right.
righteousness, then this the system sort of breaks down, and we have the danger of some of this actually falling apart in our country.
Well, isn't that one of those company expressions? I don't know whether it was Franklin or Adams, but one of those guys said, "We've given you a republic if you can keep it."
If you
And
can keep,
another one said, "Well, we will survive so long as or until the constituency realizes they can vote largesse from the public treasury. When that happens, that's the beginning of the end." And we've been down that road for 100 years,
you know,
so we haven't ended yet. But not maybe not 100 years, but 80 years anyway, a long time. The state has really given more and more money to buy votes, and that's an unfortunate situation. But I think they did a pretty good job in trying to mitigate that damage, or at least for a long time, get it so it doesn't overwhelm the system. But I don't know. Sometimes people keep saying we're at a tipping point. It feels like it sometimes. Nevertheless, I think that Constitution has really helped stop or stem the tide of some of the most egregious type of violations to what the founding fathers really wanted. Although the Democratic Party at this point in time seems to be voting a lot of communist people in there who want the state to rule. In fact, if they had their way, it feels like they want to get rid of the Constitution. I don't know how well they can do it. People say, "Oh, it can never happen," but you know what? People always say that until it happens. And what does it say? What did Reagan say? We're only one generation away from being basically. I can't remember. We're only one generation from mob rule. I can't remember what exactly the quote was. I've read it two or three times last week, but the idea that what we have is only one generation from destruction, basically, is the idea, and that's exactly true. If each person does not step up to the plate to fight for, and I don't mean fighting necessarily with guns. I'm talking about with ideas, what the founding fathers have put in place, which was based on predicate on biblical realities. That's exactly true. You know.
Now, I when I was going to Massachusetts with my family in 1991, we happened to stop by the Adams National Historic Site, where
Okay.
John Adams and his son John Quincy Adams grew up. And John Adams had his house right next door to John Quincy Adams, and so one of the things they had in John Adams' house, they were giving away copies of the Massachusetts Constitution that John Adams
Okay.
wrote, and I've got a copy of it here. Let's see if I can show a little bit of it.
It's kind of
Uh,
disappearing on me, but there we go.
well, it's disappearing on you, but I'm going to read a little bit from it. It's in his handwriting, which is really absolutely fabulous. And let me read a little bit of it. It says, "All men are born equal, free and equal, and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights, among which may be reckoned with the right of enjoying and defending their lives and liberties, that of acquiring and possessing and protecting property, in fine, and that seeking and obtaining their safety and happiness. It is a right and as well as the duty of all men in society, publicly and at stated reasons, to worship the Supreme Being, the great Creator and Preserver of the universe, and no subject shall be hurt, molested, or restrained in his person, liberty, or estate for worshiping God in the manner and season most agreeable to the dictates of his own conscience, or for his religious profession or sentiments, provided he doth not disturb the public peace or obstruct others in their religious worship." And so in this document, John Adams is very explicit in his support for the worship of God, and that is really a foundation of his document that he's talking here. And then the happiness of the people and the good order and preservation of civil government essentially depend upon piety, religion, and morality. And as these cannot be generally diffused through a community, but by the institutions of public worship of God and of public instructions in piety, religion, and morality. Therefore, to promote their happiness and to secure the good order and the preservation of their government, the people of this Commonwealth has a right to invest in their legislature with power and to authorize and require. The legislature shall from time to time authorize and require the several towns, parishes, and precincts and other bodies politic or religious societies to make suitable provision at their own expense for the institution of the public worship of God and for the support and maintenance of public Protestant teachers of piety, religion, and morality in all cases where such provision shall not be made voluntarily. And the people of this Commonwealth also have a right to and do invest their legislature with authority to join in all the subjects and attendance upon the instructions of the public teachers, therefore said at stated times and reasons. If there be any on whose instructions they shall consciously and conveniently attend, provided notwithstanding that the several towns and parishes, precincts, and other bodies politic or religious societies shall at all times have the exclusive right of electing their public teachers and contracting with them for their support and maintenance. And all monies paid by the subject to the support of worship and the public teachers aforesaid shall, if he require it, be uniformly applied to the support of public teachers on the teachers of their own religious sect or denominations, provided there be any on whose instructions he attends. Otherwise, it may be paid toward the support of the teachers or the teachers of the parish or precinct in which said monies are raised. And every denomination of Christians demeaning themselves peaceably and as good subjects of the Commonwealth shall be equally under the protection of the law, and no subordination of any sect or denomination to another shall ever be established by law.
Interestingly, Doug, he deals with Protestant and Christian. He doesn't really talk about Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, or anybody else having all these same rights. I'm just kind of interested about it. Even though it was not a state, there wasn't a state church. They did not want it. Was that written before the Constitution, Doug? Do you know?
This was written, and this was what the Commonwealth of Mass. I don't know when this was written.
Yeah.
But
that was Adams who wrote it, you said, right?
Adams wrote it, and I think it was after the Constitution was written.
So anyway, my point was I've always thought that's interesting. We've expanded those rights to include everybody who's born in America, whether you're a Muslim, a Christian, or a Catholic, or a Hindu, or a Buddhist, or anybody else. But he kind of restricted it to the Protestant Christian religion, which I thought that was kind of interesting. A lot of people don't realize that. I think it was the Declaration, or maybe the Constitution. I'm not sure. Yeah, it was signed. A lot of those people who signed it were actually Christian ministers.
That's right. Yeah.
I don't know what the percentage was. 80% of them were actually ministers.
About 80% were
which
Christian.
Basically belies the fact of what people are trying to make separation of church and state mean today, as compared to what they thought it meant back in the day. And we know that it's obvious that that's a ploy to stretch a meaning. It's what all cults do, by the way, Doug. Religious cults, but secular cults, political cults do the same thing. They twist words and meanings to make it mean what they want it to mean for today's modern day society, rather than go through the lengthy and cumbersome thing of having to have things voted on through Congress and say, okay, we're going to change this now. That's what an amendment to the Constitution is supposed to do. We're going to amend it to say this. They want to change the meaning of words so that it becomes that without having to vote on it. And that's what's happened all through the years. By the way, this recent thing last week, where the birthright citizenship got voted on, in my mind, this was very much a point to deal with about black slaves who were born in the United States. But one point seems to be always neglected on that, Doug. The birthright citizenship, that was the 14th Amendment, voted in after the Civil War, so the blacks could have, Negroes could have the vote. They were full citizens. But what they don't fully understand is that those blacks are here in this country, or yes, they were here in a horrible system from today's standards called slavery, but they were legal. Those blacks were legally here. Okay, and this belies the whole fact of all these illegals having babies coming in, or what they call tourism stuff. This was never meant to include that. So the Supreme Court, I think, really got this wrong. That's a political argument for another day. But my point of it is when you lose sight of the Christian morality, the Christian reality of what right and wrong is, you begin to stretch words and make them mean what you want them to mean. Every religious cult does the same thing. You can say, yeah, like for instance, even it's not a cult; it's more of it's a religion. Hinduism has no problem with Jesus being a son of God. They got all kinds of sons of God or many gods. They got a pantheon of gods. But when you say he's the only God, he is God. There's no other besides him, which includes the Father and the Holy Spirit. That is one God, but there's not hundreds or thousands of gods. They would have a problem with that. So those are the things that our Constitution, our founding father. In fact, I think you alluded to it earlier when you talked about George Whitfield. I don't know what time period he preached. Was it early 1700s or
Yeah,
was it late
well, it's
1700s?
mid to late
Mid to late
1700s.
1700s. But you said here, he said, the preacher George Whitfield held meetings in all the colonies and spoke the need for repentance and receiving Christ for salvation. The colonies were also under the influence of the John and Charles Wesley, the Wesley brothers, John and Charles, Roger Williams of Rhode Island, and the heritage left by the Pilgrims and the Puritans of Massachusetts. So our heritage of Christianity goes. In fact, that's the reason most people know you haven't been able to hide that fact was for religious freedom. But back to the idea we talked about the separation of church and state. That was a letter, the Danbury letter. I don't know if you want to read that, Doug, but it was like the idea that the separate church and state was not meant to make the church be over the state, but likewise, it did not mean the state had license over the church either. They were meant to be separate providences, and the separate church and state, the freedom of religion was not meant to be freedom from religion, which is what they're trying to make it now. Okay, this is what, or many people are trying to do that.
Well,
So those belies all of those things.
let's talk about the Constitution and the First Amendment. And we'll
Let's
read
do
the
that.
First Amendment. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And that's the important part. Or
Yeah,
abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So,
I like that. Doug, peaceably assemble. That
right.
goes a long ways to kind of mitigating the Black Lives Matter and some of these protests where
Right.
violence and burning buildings and people getting injured and hurt. That surely would put that down. But no, not today. That doesn't seem to be those words don't seem to really be hold a lot of sway these days. Anyway, continue, Doug.
Let's talk about the Danbury Baptists. The separation of church and state does not appear in the Constitution, but
Exactly.
it was a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the people in Danbury, Baptist people who were
Right.
concerned that there was favoritism being shown to one denomination over another. And this is what he said to Nehemiah Dodge, Ephraim Robbins, and Stephen S. Nelson, a committee of Danbury Baptist Association in the state of Connecticut. Gentlemen, the affectionate sentiments of esteem and appropriation which you are so good to express towards me on behalf of the Danbury Baptist Association gives me the highest satisfaction. My duties dictate a faithful and zealous pursuit of the interests of my constituents, and in proportion as they are persuaded of my fidelity to those duties, the discharge of them becomes more and more pleasing. Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that the act of the whole American people, which declared that the legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. And that's where the words appear.
Yep. Exactly.
Adhering to the expression of the supreme will of the nation in behalf of the rights of conscience, I shall see with sincere satisfaction of the progress of those sentiments which tend to restore to man all natural rights, convinced that he has no natural right in opposition to his social duties. I reciprocate your kind prayers for the protection and blessing of the common Father and Creator of man, and tender for you for yourselves in your religious association. Assurances of my high respect and esteem. What you can see is Thomas Jefferson really coveted the prayers of the Danbury Baptists, and he was showing that he wanted to make sure that differences in doctrine didn't cause one group to be favored over another, and I think that was the intent of his letter to them. And
Interesting. But a salient point, Doug, I reiterate, is the fact that they were dealing primarily with Christian, including Catholicism, because that was a big thing back in the day. But they were not dealing with too much. I mean, there were Hindus and Muslims in the United States at that time, but they were so insignificant. This was primarily dealing with the assumption, or if you will, the constituency they were talking about was pretty much almost all Christian. There might have been some atheists, like I said, few Muslims. I can't even think of any Buddha. Maybe a couple of Hindus. Not, but they were aware of these philosophies. But this was dealing with a Christian constituency, Doug. And within that constituency, because of the Reformation and a lot of the schisms that happened in the church, the Roman Catholics, we had pretty much we had several. We had Baptists and we had Catholics in Maryland, a lot of that. But then you had you had Reformed churches, the Dutch, and you had all kinds of different Lutherans. And so the idea was that none of those denominations could form a state church. They were not interested in having a theocracy anywhere. So people have basically run with that and said, well, they want us to have a secular state. And then they go beyond that. They say that may be true to some extent, but not a state that lords it over the church either. That's what they really did not want. They didn't want one to have power over the other. And that's the thing I want to reiterate. But it's primarily Christians, look, get it together. The state cannot lord it over you, but you no longer can lord it over us either. This is what I'm thinking. Doug, over in Europe, they still have a state church
they do,
in
yeah.
many countries, and the church is dead. I think one of the things that helped the church in the United States was the fact that they got separated from state. They didn't get subsidized. Pretty much, the only subsidy you might say is they made us tax exempt. But that really wasn't a subsidy. It would say, well, you're not going to be subject to it because you're separate from us. We can't touch you. Okay, so that's my point on that. But all of this was based on Christian principles, Doug.
Well, one last point is that
Yeah,
the revolution that happened in America had Christian roots and Christian principles. In other countries like France, where you had the French Revolution, you had people like Voltaire leading it, who were
it was
atheists,
atheism. Yep,
and that turned out horribly in terms of the bloodshed and the form of government that ended up afterwards in Napoleon. Whereas they traded one form of despotism for another. Whereas here in the United
absolutely.
States, because of the Christian roots, we have the freedom that we enjoy today. And
Amen.
with that, we'll see you next time on Revolution Against Evolution.